question becomes then, what do people need in grief? And the first thing I think people need is safety. If you boil down everything that we authors have written about grief, it really boils down to permission to grieve. It's very difficult to find that, and it's very difficult to give it to ourselves. You know, I was explaining to someone yesterday who she just felt like that she was trying she needed to do more, she needed to give more, she needed to be more active and everything. And I said, you know, if you were in a full body cast, you could lie there until you got well and never feel a sense of guilt. Grief actually puts you in that kind of position. But because there's no cast there, we automatically feel like that a few months we ought to be up, we ought to be running, we ought to be doing all these things. And so it's very difficult to find permission from ourselves to spend whatever time is necessary to take care of ourselves in any way we need to in order to walk through the journey of grief. And then it's very difficult to find safe people. I always refer to my buckets in dealing with grief. Anymore you can't listen to me talk without buckets. Let's say the bucket represents your feelings during the grieving process. And we could stop and talk a great deal about what kind of feelings would be in the bucket. I could guess at some of them, like pain would be there, lonesome, sadness. Some people would have some anger. Some people would have some fear. Some people would have some wonder, what will happen to me now? Those kinds of things. Basically, your bucket is pretty well full. And then if you add to that, what kind of thoughts would be in there? You know, what would you be thinking? Why did this happen? Why me? Where was God? What will I do now? Who will take care of me? All kinds of thoughts run through our minds. And what kind of questions, you know, would all kinds of those kinds of things, and what kind of frustrations would be there, you know, the frustration of suddenly becoming invisible and seeing people walk up the other aisle of the grocery store to keep from bumping into you, the frustration of being asked over and over and over, how are you, when you know they don't really want to know. Basically, what I'm trying to say is your bucket is absolutely full. Anyone that has experienced grief is just walking around with a bucket full of feelings and thoughts and pain. The problem also is that I have a bucket also. And see, my bucket is full of all kinds of platitudes and cheery up statements and new ways to think of things, new spin to put on what's happened to you, scripture I want to quote. And I just kind of want to come by, you know, and pour my stuff in your bucket. But the problem is your bucket is too full. There's no way that you can accept anything that I have to offer. And the other side of that is I'm afraid of your bucket. I'm scared. Because, you know, if I get in there with you, it feels like you'll get worse if I'm not sitting out here trying to cheer you up. And if I get in there with you, you may ask me things I can't answer, or you might cry, and I wouldn't know how to respond. And it's intimate in your bucket. So I really just kind of want to run by and drop it on you and then run off. I was speaking at a Compassionate Friends conference, and they asked me to speak about guilt and anger and grief. And so I asked the audience, what do you feel guilty about? And I never will forget one lady who said, all the way at the hospital, my son begged me to go back. He didn't want the transplant. He was afraid. And I wouldn't turn around. And he died. And we dealt with that for a while. And finally I came back to her and I said, you know, how many times has someone come up to you and said, he would have died anyway? Oh, she said, many. I said, has that helped? No. So how many times have they said, you were acting out of love? Many. Has that helped? No. How many times have they said, dear, it's been 3 years. Oh, she said, that happens all the time. I said, how many times have they said, God won't put any more on you than you can bear? Oh, she said, that really makes me angry. Then I said to her, would it help if I came over and hugged you and said, that must really hurt? She said, yeah, that would help. Now, why would that help? It would help because I'm getting in her bucket. I'm recognizing her pain. I'm legitimizing her feelings. I am walking with her in her bucket. I learned some things that day. I learned that healing always begins in the other person's bucket. Never begins in my bucket. There's not anything in my bucket that's going to make that person feel better. It always begins when I get in the bucket with that person. Same thing's true with you. People become healing to you when they learn how to just simply respond to your pain instead of trying to make it go away or explain it. Now that sounds awful simple, but oftentimes I hear, well, how can just talking about my grief help that much? But see, when somebody actually hears you, several things happen to you. Number one, that's how you really internalize all of the thoughts and all of the feelings that you have. You know, you've often heard that you're not learning anything when your mouth is open. That's wrong. That's when you are learning, because we get thoughts and they're all up here in our head until we get a chance to express them. And when we express them, they internalize. So talking about your experience internalizes, and that's how you actually learn. As you talk and are heard, you begin to get insight. I often say that I've been doing counseling for many years and I really don't understand how it works, because I don't know how I can just sit there and grunt every once in a while and people get better. What actually happens is, as they talk, they get insight. I even saw it happen one day. I had a motor mouth come in, and she came several times and just talked the whole hour that she was there, and never would let me talk. And finally one day, right in the middle of a talk, she stopped. She had insight kind of hit her, and she stopped, and it's almost like a Toontown stop. She just stopped, and she looked off into space and said, you know, I guess I've always felt like I had to compete with my mother. I didn't say a word. She sat there for a moment, caught herself, and talked out the rest of the hour. The next time she came, I stopped her before she could start and said, I want you to tell me something first. And she said, what? I said, tell me what you've learned so far. And she said, listen, last time when you told me I had to compete with my mother, she said, now that was profound. And I really didn't tell her. I hadn't told her that because I wanted her to think I was doing something. But what happened is, insight came. As you find safe people who will just simply acknowledge your pain and you have a chance to talk, you begin to develop insights and healing begins to happen. The third thing that happens when somebody hears you is you get a sense of being understood. I love that word, because the first thing we really want to feel is a sense of being understood. Now, it's the last thing we want to hear. You don't want people to say, I know exactly how you feel, because they don't. And no one can really understand you totally. But the sense of somebody trying to understand and accepting what we feel as we feel it is a tremendously powerful thing. My wife gives me the right to tell her story. She had double mastectomy a few years ago. She had a lot of fibroid tumors, so they took her breast off so she wouldn't get cancer. No one really prepared her for that surgery. Nobody told her how painful it was, and nobody told her what the aftermath was. And I hope I walked through it with her pretty well, but when I really started studying the word understanding, I went back to Barbara and said, Barbara, tell me what you really feel. And she said, I got up every morning thinking, I'm going to go back to that doctor and I'm going to tell him you made a mistake, put him back. And I said, why didn't you say that? She said, where would you go to say that? You know what the response is going to be. They can't do that. But wouldn't it be wonderful if there was some place where you could go and say that? And the person simply say, oh, yes, that hurts, doesn't it? Isn't it strange that that must really hurt becomes the most comforting words we can hear? Because that's so alien from the way we were raised. Instead of me saying that must really hurt, I need to tell you all the reasons why you ought to be over your hurt. And I end up trivializing. See, the opposite of understanding is not misunderstanding, it's trivialization. We don't want to be trivialized. We don't want it explained away. It'd be like if I walked in and I just cut my finger off and I said, you know, I just cut my finger off. And somebody would say, well, aren't you glad it wasn't your whole hand, you know? And yeah, I'm glad it wasn't my whole hand, but I really want you to know and notice, you know, I cut my finger off. There's nothing that I know of that's more healing for people than safe people who will simply get in their buckets. And maybe it's a good thing to stop every once in a while and examine our support system. Who are the safe people? Who are the ones? It's amazing how some people will feel safe and some won't. And a lot of times we feel trapped because our best friends are not the ones that feel safe, and we feel like that, well, their feelings are going to be hurt, and they may well be hurt. But while you're in grief, it's very important for you to find safe people and give yourself permission to be with those people who are safe. Later we'll come back and make up with those who were left out. But right now, safe people, somebody to get in your bucket. It's the most healing thing that can happen.